And for anybody who might check in on this sermon later when it's recorded, you've probably figured out by now that I'm not Rev Ed. I'm Rev Matt, and I'm the rector at Trinity Episcopal here in Bloomington, and I'm helping Ed out as he has done for me on many occasions. So I'm very glad to do that, and also glad to have a chance to finally celebrate with all of you. Colorado caught on fire a few weeks ago. Now, usually the West waits until June before it starts catching on fire. Floods have scoured this country and Europe. Tornadoes have descended. Powerful winter storms and typhoons have slammed our country and others. Isaiah told Israel that you shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. However, we seem very much to be headed towards forsaken and desolate. Global climate change has intensified our weather events, has made extreme weather more frequent, and brought even more unpredictability to weather, which was never very predictable to begin with. And this, I actually believe, is only the beginning. We've crossed a dangerous threshold in terms of the amount of carbon in our atmosphere. When I was in seminary 10 years ago, we were hoping to keep the amount of carbon in the atmosphere down to 350 parts per million. Last time I checked, it's up at 417 parts per million. So we've almost certainly altered our climate for actually centuries to come. We will have to contend with extreme and scary weather events for the rest of our lives, for the rest of our children's lives, their children's lives, and so on. And as a former archaeologist, I can actually confidently say, based on evidence for past changes to the climate, humans have not responded well to climate change. Civilizations collapse, wars begin, whole economies and ways of life disappear. While at the same time, in this century, it seems like about a quarter, maybe more, of this country's people don't believe the climate is changing at all. Another quarter agree it is, but don't think we've done anything to make it change or that we need to do anything about it. And all the world's governments just dither and make minor agreements that will have minor effects. And so we end up reasonably asking, what can we do? We don't have buckets of power. All the personal changes that we can make and how we use energy and how we consume things and dispose of them, we can make all those. They're good to do, but they're still just tiny drops in the bucket of what needs to be done. Feels both baffling and terrifying at the same time. I've begun to think that actually one of the main things we can do is form ourselves as a people who can respond as God would want us to respond to the changes that are coming. St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians gives us an important place to start orienting ourselves. And I think the first thing we have to do is orient our souls, orient ourselves spiritually, because the climate crisis is a spiritual crisis as much as anything else. And if we can follow Paul's commands, his advice, his rules, we can actually show others that seeing ourselves as intimately connected in the Holy Spirit can actually help us survive and maybe even thrive in a changed world. The small community of new Christians that Paul had founded in Corinth seems to have gone straight to heck about 10 minutes after he left. The letter that we hear today, the piece of the letter that we hear today, and the letter itself was written when Paul had received at a distance, some people think he was in Ephesus, he had received distressing news about his congregation. One fellow was sleeping with his mother-in-law, and moreover, nobody seemed to be bothered by that. Visiting brothels seemed to be a common practice among the community. And then at the same time, there were other people who were deciding not to get married because, Jesus was coming back soon. And worst of all, in Paul's opinion, were internal divisions within the community that formed very quickly. Christians were suing each other. Factions had formed around who had baptized who. Some people felt that because they had visions or spoke in tongues or could prophesy, that they were more important than others. All of that is the reasoning and the context behind Paul's discussion of the relationship between the Holy Spirit and the individual members of the church. And he says in a famous passage, now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates them all in everyone. Paul is making it absolutely clear that while there are differences in the community, the members must remember that they are actually one people, one body, brought together by a single God for a single purpose, the healing of a broken world. And for Paul, even though members of the community do have different skills and talents, all of these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, and this is crucial, just as the Spirit chooses. I think a key point here is that Paul is driving home the idea that it's the Holy Spirit who chooses who gets what gift. We humans have no control over that. And it's beyond our ability to even guess why the Spirit works as she does. I would even suggest that, given Paul's distress over the bragging and conflicts in the church, that we should realize that we might not even know what gifts are Spirit given and what gifts are just human skills. For after all, gifts of the Spirit are given just as the Spirit chooses. The message for us, I believe, at this moment in time is to actually apply this reasoning, this way of thinking about community, about being one body with many gifts that sometimes we don't even know who's gifted and who isn't. We have to apply that way of thinking to actually the whole world, to all the people in the world, and not just people in our church. We do have profound divisions between people in this country and between countries about how we view climate change and what we're supposed to do about it or not. However, we don't simply get to completely rule out and ignore those who disagree with us. They too are united to us by God. We are all brought together by the same Spirit for the healing of a broken world. And we must have the humility to accept that we might not have all the answers. The Spirit gives people gifts and wisdom and insight as she chooses, and not as we choose, or even as we can easily recognize. To thrive in the coming future, we, each and every one of us, have to form both our minds and our spirits so that we always look for our connections to others, for the presence of Christ in others, for the presence of the Spirit in others. In fact, so that we are constantly looking for what might be divine in all others. If we can do that, I think that gives us a strong orientation, a strong spiritual foundation to more easily work with the folks who disagree with us. And then, formed as true Christians, we have to approach those we disagree with in a spirit of humility and inquisitiveness, searching, listening for what gifts, what solutions, what creativity the Holy Spirit may have given others. Because honestly, hurling insults at each other, which seems to be about where we are now, is not getting us anywhere. And I actually think IU here is probably a great place to start practicing this, to learn it. I'm sure there's a huge number of very smart people going to classes, dining halls, dorms, apartments, coffee shops, wherever, and I'm sure that talk about climate change comes up. And I bet you there are disagreements. And so I would challenge all of you to actually find the people that disagree with you and find a way to talk productively with them, recognizing that the same Spirit is working in them as it is in you. I think one of the problems that sometimes we have as a progressive church or as the people who think about the world and climate change in a particular way, is that we don't try to engage with other people. Maybe we're afraid that it's going to turn into a bad argument, or we feel frustrated, or we're not going to get anywhere, or maybe they're going to hurt our feelings, maybe they're going to insult us. But if we can have the kind of spiritual grounding that says, there just might be a spark of the divine there too, I think that we can have a better way of doing it. And my hope is that if you guys learn this now, you can teach the rest of my generation and the generation above how to do it, because we're not doing it very well. And that's how we're going to get through the changes in climate that are coming. We're going to get through it together. War, collapse of civilizations, famines, fires, floods, tornadoes, they can all be survived and their effects can be mitigated when we remember that we are all united for a common purpose, and we all have the gifts of the Spirit to heal the world. For actually the words forsaken and desolate that Isaiah talked about, those are words that speak to loneliness, to separation from others and from creation. And God has told us, being forsaken and desolate is not a necessary outcome, nor is it what God desires. All we have to do is invite others into the joy of union in diversity that the Holy Spirit has brought to us.